October 14th, 1872, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The autumn mist hung low over the rolling farmland as County Clerk Ezekiel Morrison made his way down the narrow dirt path toward the Hartwell homestead. In his weathered leather satchel, he carried 12 death certificates, all bearing the same family name, all documenting the deaths of children who had supposedly lived under one roof. What Morrison did not yet know was that his routine inspection would uncover one of the most disturbing mysteries in Pennsylvania's documented history. The contradiction was stark and unsettling. 12 official death records, meticulously filed and properly notarized. Yet only 3 small graves could be found on the entire property. 9 documented deaths had seemingly vanished without a trace, leaving behind only paperwork and an increasingly horrifying question. Where were the missing children? In the days that followed, Morrison's discovery would crack open a case that revealed the fragile nature of life and death records in 19th century America, and expose truths so disturbing that many who witnessed them would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget what they had seen. The journals and testimonies that emerged from the Hartwell property would paint a picture of something far darker than simple record-keeping errors, something that challenged the very notion of what it meant to disappear from history entirely. But to understand how 12 lives could vanish on paper while leaving barely a whisper in the earth, we must first understand the world in which the Hartwells lived, a world where children were currency, records were fragile, and entire lives could be erased with nothing more than silence and time. The year 1872 marked a peculiar moment in American history. The Civil War had ended 7 years prior, but its scars ran deeper than battlefield wounds. Across the nation, thousands of children had been orphaned, their fathers claimed by war, and their mothers often unable to care for them alone. The infrastructure for handling these displaced souls was primitive at best, a patchwork system of churches, private families, and rudimentary orphanages that operated with little oversight and even less documentation, or even months after a death occurred, and the verification process was minimal. In remote areas like Lancaster County, a family physician's word, or sometimes even a family's own testimony, was sufficient to document a death officially. This fragmented system created countless opportunities for discrepancies, but it also created something more sinister: the possibility for entire lives to disappear without anyone asking the right questions. The Hartwell family had built their reputation slowly and carefully over 2 decades. Thomas Hartwell, a stern but seemingly devout man in his 50s, had inherited the 200-acre property from his father in 1851. His wife, Margaret, was known throughout the community as a woman of quiet piety, who never missed Sunday service and always had a kind word for the traveling ministers who frequently stopped at their home. By all accounts, the Hartwells were model citizens. They regularly took in orphaned and displaced children, providing them with food, shelter, and what appeared to be genuine care. Neighbors often commented on Margaret's maternal nature and the way she seemed to genuinely love each child who came under her care. The couple's own 3 biological children, 2 daughters and a son, were well regarded in the community, polite and well-dressed whenever they appeared in town. But there were subtle signs that something was amiss, details that only became significant in hindsight. The number of children living on the Hartwell property seemed to fluctuate in ways that neighbors found difficult to track. Some months, the family appeared to have as many as 8 or 9 children running about the property. Other times, only 2 or 3 could be seen. When asked about the discrepancies, The Hartwells would simply explain that some children had been reunited with distant relatives or had been transferred to other families better suited to care for them. The explanations seemed reasonable enough in a time when such arrangements were common. Few people thought to question the details, and fewer still thought to verify the official paperwork that documented these transfers and occasional deaths. The first crack in the Hartwell facade came from an unexpected source: Reverend Samuel Blackwood, a traveling Methodist minister who made regular circuits through Lancaster County. Blackwood had a remarkable memory for faces at consumption and had been laid to rest in the family cemetery. Yet when I requested to offer a prayer at his grave, I was told the site was too distant and overgrown to visit safely. Blackwood's suspicions deepened when he realized he could not recall attending any funerals for the children who had allegedly died on the Hartwell property. In a small community where every death was marked by communal mourning and support, the absence of funeral services for these children struck him as deeply unusual. The minister began keeping more detailed records of his visits, noting the names and descriptions of every child he encountered at the Hartwell homestead. Over the course of several months, a disturbing pattern emerged. Children would be present for one visit, absent for the next, and when he inquired about their whereabouts, he was invariably told they had either died of illness or been sent to live with relatives in distant counties. Blackwood's growing concerns were echoed by other members of the community. Sarah Pemberton, who lived on the adjacent property, kept her own informal records of the Hartwell household in the margins of her daily journal. Her entries, discovered years later, painted an increasingly troubling picture. March 15, 1872, she wrote, "Saw the Hartwell children playing in the yard this morning. Counted 7, including the new boy they took in last month. By evening, could only see 4. Asked Margaret about it when I encountered her in town, and she said the others were helping Thomas with work in the far fields." 3 weeks later, April 7, 1872. No sign of the new boy for several days now. Margaret mentioned in passing that he had taken ill and died suddenly. Yet I heard no commotion, saw no doctor visit, witnessed no funeral preparations. In my 43 years, I have never known a child to die so quietly that the neighbors heard nothing of it. These fragmentary observations might have remained nothing more than idle gossip, if not for a chance encounter between Sarah Pemberton and Dr. Edmund Carrick, the physician who supposedly treated many of the children who died on the Hartwell property. During a chance meeting at the general store, produce an organized file of paperwork documenting the care and eventual disposition of every child who had lived under his roof. The death certificates were particularly impressive in their apparent thoroughness. Each document contained detailed information about the deceased child: full name, approximate age, cause of death, and the signature of Dr. Edmund Carrick as the attending physician. The dates of death were spread across a 3-year period, suggesting a pattern of occasional tragic losses rather than any systematic wrongdoing. But when Morrison requested to visit the family cemetery to pay his respects to the deceased children, the first significant inconsistency emerged. Behind the main house, in a grove of oak trees that served as the family burial ground, he found only 3 small headstones. Each stone bore a simple inscription with a child's name and dates. But even these 3 graves raised questions. The dates on the stones did not match the dates on the death certificates Morrison carried in his satchel, and none of the names on the headstones appeared in his documentation. When Morrison pointed out the discrepancy, Thomas Hartwell remained calm and provided a ready explanation. The family had, he claimed, run out of money for proper headstones after the first few deaths. The remaining 9 children had been buried in simple graves, marked only with wooden crosses, which had long since rotted away and been reclaimed by the forest. As for the date discrepancies, Hartwell suggested that the stone carver had made errors when creating the monuments. The explanations were plausible, but Morrison's trained eye noticed something else troubling about the burial ground. The soil patterns didn't support Hartwell's claims of 12 graves. Even accounting for settling and natural changes over time, the earth showed evidence of only 3 or 4 disturbances, not the dozen that should have been present if all the documented deaths had truly occurred on the property. Morrison returned to town with more questions than answers, but his concerns deepened significantly when he began to investigate the death certificates more thoroughly. His first stop was Dr. Carrick's office. Disturbing recollections of the Hartwell family. I was called to attend Margaret Hartwell on 4 separate occasions, she told Morrison in a sworn statement dated October 21, 1872. Each time I helped deliver a healthy infant, but in every case, when I returned to check on the mother and child within a week of the birth, I was told the baby had died suddenly and had already been buried. I found this curious, as infant deaths, while tragically common, typically involve several days of illness, during which the midwife is consulted frequently. Greenwood's testimony raised the possibility that the Hartwell mystery extended beyond the officially documented deaths, to include children whose births and deaths had occurred entirely outside the formal record-keeping system. But the most disturbing evidence was yet to come. Hidden in the attic of the main house, investigators discovered a collection of journals and personal papers that belonged to Rebecca Hartwell, the family's eldest daughter. Rebecca, now 22 years old and married to a farmer in neighboring Chester County, had apparently kept detailed records of life in the Hartwell household during her teenage years. The journal entries, written in a careful hand over several years, painted a picture that contradicted everything the community thought they knew about the Hartwell family. Rather than the caring, devout household that neighbors observed, Rebecca's private writings revealed a home governed by strange rituals and inexplicable practices. June 12, 1869, one entry read, "Another child came to live with us today. A girl, perhaps 6 years of age, with dark hair and frightened eyes. Mother says she will be happier here than wherever she came from. But I notice Mother always says this about the new children. They never seem to stay long enough to find out if it's true." As the entries continued, Rebecca's observations grew increasingly dark and confused. She wrote of children who would disappear suddenly in the middle of the night, of ceremonies conducted in the barn after dark, and of her parents' strange preoccupation with what she called preserving innocence. September 4th, 1869, Rebecca wrote, "Heard crying from the barn convinced me that innocence, once lost, can never be preserved through earthly means. I must leave this place before I become complicit in whatever darkness has taken root here." Rebecca's journal provided the roadmap that investigators needed to uncover the full scope of the Hartwell secret. Following her references to the barn cellar, authorities discovered a hidden room beneath the main barn structure. What they found there defied easy explanation and challenged the investigators' understanding of what the Hartwell family had actually been doing with the children in their care. The cellar contained dozens of small items, clearly belonging to children: clothing, shoes, toys, and personal effects that had obviously been carefully preserved and organized. Each item was labeled with a name and date, creating a methodical catalog of children who had passed through the Hartwell household over nearly a decade. But the most disturbing discovery was a collection of detailed records kept by Thomas Hartwell himself. Unlike the fraudulent death certificates filed with the county, these private documents told a very different story about the fate of the children who had lived on the property. Hartwell's records spoke of experiments in extending innocence and methods for preserving the essential nature of childhood. The documents were written in a combination of medical terminology and religious mysticism that made their exact meaning difficult to decipher. But their general thrust was unmistakable. Thomas and Margaret Hartwell had been using the children in their care for some form of systematic experimentation. The records made reference to various treatments and procedures designed to prevent the children from aging beyond their pure state. Some entries discussed methods for transferring vital essence from younger children to older ones, while others described attempts to preserve the immortal soul in its original condition. Most disturbing of all, the records indicated that these experiments had been largely unsuccessful, resulting in the deaths of the children subjected to them. But rather than acknowledging these deaths as the result of their own actions, the Hartwell isolation, and what the documents euphemistically referred to as spiritual interventions. The exact nature of these interventions remained unclear from the surviving records, but their fatal consequences were undeniable. Margaret Hartwell's role in these activities was documented as both assistant and enabler. Her own journal entries, discovered alongside her husband's papers, revealed a woman who had initially resisted her husband's theories, but had gradually become convinced of their validity through a combination of religious fervor and psychological manipulation. "I know that what we do appears cruel to those who cannot understand," she wrote in an entry dated July 10, 1871. "But I have come to see that true mercy sometimes requires actions that seem harsh. Better for these innocent souls to be preserved in their pure state than to be allowed to grow into the corruption and sin that awaits all who reach adulthood in this fallen world." The discovery of these documents sent shockwaves through the local community and prompted immediate action by both county authorities and federal investigators. The scale and systematic nature of the Hartwells' activities suggested possible connections to similar cases in other parts of the country, raising the specter of a broader network of individuals engaged in similar practices. But as investigators moved to arrest Thomas and Margaret Hartwell, they discovered that the couple had vanished. Sometime during the night of October 23, 1872, the Hartwells had abandoned their property, taking with them whatever portable evidence they could carry, and leaving behind only the children who remained in their care. The 3 children found on the property, 2 girls aged approximately 12 and 14, and a boy of perhaps 10, were in a state of severe malnutrition and psychological trauma. When questioned about their experiences, they were unable or unwilling to provide coherent accounts of their time with the Hartwells, speaking only in fragments about the ceremonies and the room below ground where children went to sleep forever. The children's testimony, combined with the physical evidence discovered on the property, painted a picture of systematic abuse and murder that had continued for years under the guise of caring for displaced and orphaned children, buried in remote locations or destroyed through means that left no identifiable remains. Others suggested that some of the children might still be alive, sold or transferred to other individuals engaged in similar activities. But perhaps the most disturbing possibility was raised by Rebecca Hartwell herself, who had returned to the area upon hearing of her parents' crimes. In her final journal entry, discovered after her own mysterious disappearance 3 weeks after the investigation began, she wrote, "I fear that my parents' experiments may have succeeded in ways they never intended. I have seen shadows in the barn that move without bodies to cast them, heard voices calling from the cellar long after it has been emptied and sealed. Perhaps innocence, once preserved through such unnatural means, cannot rest peacefully, even in death." The immediate aftermath of the Hartwell investigation was swift but incomplete. County authorities took custody of the surviving children and launched a broader investigation into the family's connections throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Federal investigators examined the possibility that the Hartwells had been part of a larger network of individuals engaged in similar crimes against children. But as the investigation progressed, a strange pattern of evidence disappearance began to emerge. Documents that had been carefully catalogued and stored would vanish from locked filing cabinets. Witnesses who had provided detailed testimonies would suddenly become unable to recall key details of their statements. Physical evidence would be misplaced or destroyed through what appeared to be bureaucratic incompetence, but began to seem increasingly systematic. Most disturbing of all, the 3 surviving children from the Hartwell property disappeared from the state-run facility where they had been placed for care and recovery. Despite intensive searches, no trace of them was ever found, leading some to speculate that they had been retrieved by associates of the Hartwells or by the Hartwells themselves. By 1875, less than 3 years after the initial investigation, official records of the Hartwell case had been reduced to a few fragmentary reports and witness statements. The detailed documentation of the family's activities, the physical evidence recovered from their property, and the testimonies of the surviving children, discouraging potential buyers from acquiring the property. The house and outbuildings gradually fell into decay, reclaimed by forest growth and weather. But the reports of ghostly children continued well into the 20th century. By 1900, the Hartwell case had been almost entirely erased from official memory. The few surviving documents made no mention of the systematic nature of the crimes or the evidence of experimentation on children. Instead, the case was classified as a simple instance of fraudulent documentation, with Thomas and Margaret Hartwell listed as having fled the area to avoid charges of filing false death certificates. The broader implications of the case, the evidence of organized abuse and murder of children, the possible connections to similar activities elsewhere, and the systematic disappearance of evidence were completely omitted from the historical record. Anyone attempting to research the case would find only scattered references to record-keeping irregularities and the sudden departure of a farming family from Lancaster County in 1872. This pattern of historical erasure raises troubling questions about how many similar cases may have been similarly obscured or forgotten. In an era when record-keeping was primitive and oversight minimal, how many children may have vanished into systems designed to protect them? How many Thomas and Margaret Hartwells operated in the shadows of 19th century America? their crimes hidden by the very chaos and disorganization that made their activities possible. The fragility of historical memory becomes particularly troubling when considered in the context of the most vulnerable members of society. Children who were already displaced, orphaned, or unwanted were precisely the individuals whose disappearances were least likely to be noticed or investigated. Their deaths could be explained away as illness or accident, their disappearances attributed to transfers to other families or institutions. The Hartwell case demonstrates how easily entire lives could vanish from history, leaving behind only the faintest traces for future investigators to discover. If not for the chance observations of a traveling minister, record-keeping, and limited oversight that characterized 19th century America, created countless opportunities for similar crimes to occur and be concealed. Rebecca Hartwell's final journal entry, discovered decades later in the basement of a neighboring farmhouse, provides perhaps the most haunting perspective on her family's crimes and their broader implications. Writing just days before her own disappearance, she reflected on the nature of innocence and the terrible price of attempting to preserve it through unnatural means. "I have come to understand that innocence cannot be preserved through force or manipulation," she wrote. "True innocence exists only in the natural progression from childhood to adulthood, in the gradual accumulation of experience and wisdom that allows human beings to grow and change. My parents' attempt to halt this natural process did not preserve innocence, it destroyed it utterly, replacing the natural joy and curiosity of childhood with fear, pain, and ultimately death." But perhaps most disturbing of all, her final entry continued, is the realization that their crimes will likely be forgotten, erased from history, by those who find the truth too uncomfortable to acknowledge. The children who died on our property will become nothing more than names in fraudulent documents, their suffering unremembered, and their deaths unacknowledged. In seeking to preserve innocence, my parents instead ensured that these innocent lives would be lost, not just to death, but to historical oblivion. Rebecca's prediction proved remarkably accurate. By the middle of the 20th century, the Hartwell case had been so thoroughly erased from official memory that even local historians had difficulty reconstructing the basic facts of what had occurred. The property itself was eventually sold to developers, and the original homestead was demolished to make way for a residential subdivision. Today, families live in comfortable homes built on the same ground where the Hartwell experiments took place, largely unaware of the dark history beneath their foundations. The old barn cellar was filled in and paved over to create a community playground, where children now play above the space where other children once suffered and died. The 12 death certificates that started Ezekiel Morrison's possibility that our historical record is shaped not just by what happened, but by what those in power chose to preserve and what they chose to forget. The Hartwell case ultimately represents something far more troubling than the crimes of a single family. It demonstrates the ease with which entire lives can be erased from history, particularly the lives of society's most vulnerable members. It shows how systems designed to protect children can become mechanisms for their exploitation, and how the very chaos that makes such exploitation possible also makes it easy to cover up. In our modern era of digital records and comprehensive documentation, it might be tempting to believe that such systematic erasure of evidence would be impossible. But the Hartwell case reminds us that historical memory is always fragile, always subject to the interests and priorities of those who control the narrative. The 12 children whose deaths were falsely documented in those fraudulent certificates represent countless others whose stories have been lost to deliberate forgetting. Their names were erased from the official record, their graves were never properly marked, and their suffering was never officially acknowledged. In death, as in life, they remained invisible to the systems that should have protected them. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Hartwell case is not the crimes themselves, but the ease with which they were forgotten. If 12 documented lives could disappear so completely from the historical record, how many others suffered similar fates? How many children vanished into systems designed to care for them, leaving behind nothing more than fraudulent paperwork and fabricated explanations? These questions have no comfortable answers. They force us to confront the possibility that our understanding of history is built on a foundation of selective memory, that the stories we tell about our past have been carefully curated to exclude the most disturbing truths about how our society has treated its most vulnerable members. The empty graves behind the Hartwell homestead stand as monuments not just to the specific children who died there, but to all the children whose stories have been erased from history. They remind us that the price of forgetting is often paid by those who had no voice in life and exist now only as shadows in history, barely visible traces of suffering that someone, somewhere, decided the world was better off forgetting. These are the ghosts that haunt our historical consciousness, the voices that call to us from the margins of documented experience, reminding us that the past we think we know is only the past that those in power chose to preserve. Behind the official narratives and comfortable stories lie countless other truths, darker and more disturbing, waiting to be rediscovered by those brave enough to look beyond the sanitized version of history we prefer to remember. The Hartwell family vanished into the mists of historical oblivion, taking with them the secrets of what they had done and why they had done it. But their legacy remains in the questions their case raises about the nature of historical memory and the price we pay for our selective forgetting. In choosing to erase their crimes from the record, history ensured that the children who died would be forgotten twice, first in death and then in memory. Perhaps that is the most chilling truth of all, that innocence, once lost to such systematic cruelty, can be lost again to the even more systematic cruelty of historical amnesia. The children who suffered and died on the Hartwell property were denied not only their lives, but their rightful place in the historical record that should have honored their memory and acknowledged their suffering. In the silence that has settled over their story, we can hear the echo of countless other silences, other stories deliberately untold, other lives deliberately forgotten. The Hartwell case reminds us that the most important history is often the history that someone decided we shouldn't know, and that the price of such selective memory is always paid by those who can no longer speak for themselves.